Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. Sometimes the truth you've been hiding can destroy everything you thought you wanted, or it can set you free in ways you never imagined. Julia Martinez sits in Dr. Kara Smith's office, 6 months pregnant and alone, trying to find the words for something she's never said out loud. Her boyfriend David left 3 weeks ago without explanation, and now she's facing motherhood completely on her own. But as Julia breaks down in that quiet office, what comes out of her mouth shocks even her experienced therapist. The confession she makes will change everything about her story. It's not just about David leaving or being scared to raise a child alone. It's about a secret so painful that Julia buried it even from herself. Dr. Smith has heard many difficult stories in her 20 years of practice, but what Julia reveals will stay with her long after the session ends. What truth has Julia been hiding that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Julia Martinez had stood in her downtown apartment kitchen, coffee mug in hand, watching David read the morning paper in that methodical way of his section by section, never skipping ahead to the sports page like other men she'd known. The autumn light filtered through their floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in that golden glow that made their life together seem like something from a magazine spread. She'd been 38 then, successful, and utterly convinced that she had finally figured out how to build the kind of life that would make her mother proud. The apartment itself was a testament to Julia's need for control. Every throw pillow had its place, every book on the shelf arranged by height and color. The kitchen counters gleamed without a single coffee ring or crumb, and the refrigerator hummed quietly behind a surface free of magnets, photos, or any evidence of the messy humanity that lived within those walls. David had often joked that he was afraid to set anything down without first asking permission, but Julia had taken it as a compliment. Order meant safety. Control meant love wouldn't slip away when you weren't paying attention. Julia's career as a marketing director at Henderson and Associates had been built on the same principles. She arrived at the office each morning at 7:30 sharp. Her presentations prepared days in advance, her client relationships managed with the precision of a Swiss watch. Her colleagues respected her thoroughness, her ability to anticipate problems before they arose, and her talent for making even the most difficult clients feel heard and understood. What they didn't know was that Julia's perfectionism wasn't born from ambition. It was born from a bone-deep terror of disappointing anyone the way she had spent her childhood disappointing her mother. Margaret Martinez had been a woman of few words and even fewer embraces. Julia's earliest memories were of trying to earn her mother's attention through perfect report cards, clean rooms, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate what Margaret needed before she asked. But no matter how hard Julia tried, her mother remained emotionally unreachable, locked behind a wall of quiet disapproval that Julia never learned to scale. Even now, at 38, Julia found herself arranging her life in ways that might finally earn the warmth that had always felt just out of reach. David represented something different. When they'd met 2 years ago at a gallery opening, Julia there for work. David because he genuinely loved art. He'd been the first man who didn't seem to need her to be perfect. He was a high school English teacher, thoughtful and quiet, with an easy laugh and a tendency to leave books scattered around whatever space he occupied. In the early days of their relationship, Julia had found his gentle chaos both charming and terrifying. He would leave coffee cups on end tables, forget to make the bed, and sometimes eat cereal for dinner because he'd gotten lost in grading papers. But he also remembered the exact way she liked her coffee, noticed when she'd changed her hair by even half an inch, and had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen in ways she'd never experienced. The pregnancy had been unplanned but not unwelcome, at least not at first. Julia had stared at the positive test in their pristine bathroom, her mind immediately jumping to logistics. When to tell David, how to rearrange their spare bedroom, what kind of crib would match their existing furniture. She'd already begun mentally organizing the chaos that a baby would bring, confident that she could manage this new challenge the same way she'd managed everything else in her life. But as the weeks passed and her body began to change in ways she couldn't control, something else had begun to shift. Late at night, when David was asleep beside her, Julia would lie awake with her hand on her growing belly and feel a panic so deep it made her chest tight. What if she became like her mother? What if the same coldness that had defined her childhood was already growing inside her, waiting to emerge the moment her child looked to her for the kind of love Margaret had never been able to give? These fears she kept to herself, the same way she'd learned to keep everything important locked away where it couldn't be used against her. When David asked how she was feeling, Julia would smile and talk about morning sickness or baby names, never mentioning the dreams where she held an infant who looked at her with Margaret's disappointed eyes. When her friends at work threw her a small celebration, she accepted their congratulations with grace, never admitting that she sometimes caught herself wondering if there was still time to change her mind about everything. David, for his part, had seemed genuinely excited about becoming a father, though Julia noticed he'd grown quieter as her pregnancy progressed. She'd attributed it to normal anxiety about their changing life, the natural nervousness any man might feel about supporting a family. But now, looking back, she could see the signs she'd missed. The way he'd sometimes stare off into space during dinner, the increasing frequency of his evening walks, the careful way he'd begun choosing his words when they talked about the future. Their relationship had always been built on a foundation of comfortable routine rather than deep emotional excavation. They shared morning coffee and evening news, discussed their days in the broad strokes that kept things pleasant and uncomplicated. Julia preferred it that way. She'd had enough drama in her childhood to last several lifetimes. David seemed to understand her need for predictability, and she respected his quiet nature. Neither of them pushed for the kind of vulnerability that might have prevented the disaster that was coming. Julia's best friend Lisa had been the only person to notice the cracks forming. Lisa worked in social services and had developed an eye for the subtle signs of relationships under stress. Over lunch one Tuesday, she'd asked Julia directly if everything was okay at home. Julia had laughed off the question, deflecting with jokes about pregnancy hormones and David's tendency to rearrange the bookshelf when he was thinking through a lesson plan. But Lisa's concerned expression had stayed with her, planted a seed of awareness that maybe things weren't as solid as Julia had convinced herself they were. At work, Julia's colleague Tom had also begun to notice changes. Tom was one of the few people Julia trusted with anything approaching personal information, partly because his own quiet competence reminded her of the father she'd never had. He'd mentioned that she seemed tired lately, stressed in a way that went beyond the normal pressures of pregnancy and deadlines. Julia had brushed off his concern too, but she'd started to wonder if her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack in ways she couldn't control. The truth was, Julia had spent so many years perfecting the art of appearing to have everything together that she'd lost track of what she actually felt about anything. She knew she was supposed to be excited about the baby, grateful for David's support, optimistic about their future. But beneath the surface of her organized life, something was shifting, something that felt dangerous and uncontrollable. The pregnancy had awakened fears she thought she'd outgrown, and David's increasing distance only amplified her growing sense that she was about to fail at the most important thing she'd ever attempted. Looking back now, sitting in Dr. Smith's office with tears streaming down her face, Julia could see how desperately they'd both been pretending that everything was fine. They'd sleepwalked through the last few months of their relationship, each carrying secrets and fears they couldn't name, let alone share. The apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a museum of a life that had never been as real as she'd needed it to be. The wedding ring still circled her finger, though David had stopped wearing his weeks before he left. Julia twisted it now as she spoke to Dr. Smith. The small circle of gold that represented promises they'd never actually made and a future they'd never honestly discussed. She'd been so focused on creating the appearance of a perfect life that she'd forgotten to actually live it. Now, with David gone and the baby growing larger inside her every day, Julia was finally being forced to confront the woman she'd become and the mother she was terrified she might be. Julia had woken that Tuesday morning to the sound of David moving around the apartment with unusual purpose. It wasn't like him to be up before the alarm, especially not on a weekday when his first class didn't start until 9. She'd listened from bed as he opened and closed dresser drawers, his footsteps careful and deliberate in a way that sent an uncomfortable prickle of awareness up her spine. "Everything okay?" She'd called out, her voice thick with sleep. "Fine," he'd answered, but there was something hollow in his tone that made her stomach tighten. "Go back to sleep. I'm just getting an early start." But Julia couldn't go back to sleep. She lay there listening to the sounds of David making coffee, opening the refrigerator, setting something down on the kitchen counter with more care than necessary. When she finally heard the front door close behind him, the silence that followed felt different somehow, not peaceful, but empty in a way that made her chest feel tight. She'd gotten up then, padding to the kitchen in her pajamas with one hand, resting on her growing belly. The coffee maker was still warm, David's favorite mug sitting clean in the dishwasher, where he never remembered to put it. Everything appeared normal, except for the envelope propped against the sugar bowl, her name written across the front in David's careful handwriting. Julia had stared at that envelope for a long time before opening it, some deep part of her already, knowing that whatever was inside would change everything. Her hand shook as she unfolded the single sheet of paper, David's words blurring slightly through the tears that came before she'd even finished reading. "Julia," the letter began, "I'm not good at this kind of conversation, which is probably part of the problem. By the time you read this, I'll already be gone. I know that makes me a coward, and I know you deserve better than a letter, but I can't seem to find the words when I'm looking at you. I can't be the father this child deserves. I can't be the man you need me to be. I thought I could figure it out, thought I could become someone worthy of the family we're supposed to be, but I was wrong. You and the baby will be better off without. Emmy, I'm sorry for everything I should have been and wasn't. Please don't try to find me. David." The letter had fallen from Julia's hands as she sank into one of their kitchen chairs, her mind struggling to process the words she'd just read. This couldn't be happening. They just discussed baby names the night before. I'd spent the weekend looking at cribs online. David had seemed tired lately, maybe a little distant, but Julia had attributed that to normal pre-fatherhood anxiety. She'd never imagined he was planning to leave. Her first instinct had been to call him, but when she grabbed her phone, she discovered he'd already disconnected his number. She tried his email next, but her message bounced back immediately, account not found. It was as if David had systematically erased himself from her life while she slept, leaving nothing behind but a few lines of devastating explanation that explained nothing at all. Julia had spent the rest of that morning in a state of shocked disbelief, moving through the apartment looking for signs she might have missed. David's clothes were gone from the closet, his books cleared from the shelves, his coffee mug nowhere to be found. Even his toothbrush had vanished from the bathroom, leaving behind a space on the counter that looked accusatory in its emptiness. He'd been thorough, clinical even in his departure. The only evidence he'd ever lived there was the faint scent of his cologne clinging to the pillowcase on his side of the bed. By noon, when the reality finally began to sink in, Julia had called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. She'd spent the afternoon curled on their couch, her couch now staring at David's letter and trying to understand what "I can't be the father this child deserves" actually meant. Was he saying he didn't love her? That he'd never wanted the baby? That he'd been pretending for months while planning his escape? The worst part was how little the letter actually explained. David had always been a man of few words, but this felt cruel in its brevity. After 2 years together, after planning a life and creating a child, didn't she deserve more than 4 sentences of explanation? Didn't their relationship warrant at least an honest conversation about whatever had driven him away? When Lisa had called that evening to check in, Julia had broken down completely. Through tears and broken sentences, she tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt surreal even as she spoke them. David was gone. He wasn't coming back. She was going to be a single mother to a child she wasn't sure she wanted, abandoned by a man she thought she knew. Lisa had come over immediately, bringing groceries and practical comfort in the form of soup and tissues. She'd held Julia while she cried, made tea with hands that stayed steady when Julia shook, and listened without judgment as Julia poured out her confusion and rage. But even Lisa's presence couldn't fill the enormous hole David's departure had torn in Julia's carefully ordered world. "Have you thought about calling his school?" Lisa had suggested gently. "Maybe someone there knows where he went." But Julia had already thought of that, had already imagined the humiliation of admitting to David's colleagues that he vanished without warning. What would she say? That the man they knew as reliable and kind had abandoned his pregnant girlfriend with nothing but a note? That she'd been so oblivious to his unhappiness that his departure had come as a complete shock. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of disbelief and mounting panic. Julia had always prided herself on her ability to handle whatever life threw at her, but David's abandonment had shattered something fundamental in her sense of control. She found herself unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to concentrate on anything beyond the growing reality that she was truly, completely alone. At work, she'd tried to maintain her usual composure, but Tom had noticed the cracks almost immediately. Her presentations lacked their usual polish. Her attention wandered during meetings, and she'd snapped at a client over something trivial behavior so unlike her that Tom had pulled her aside to ask if everything was okay. Julia had lied, of course, claimed she was just tired from the pregnancy, but she could see the concern in his eyes. The real breaking point had come during a routine prenatal appointment when Dr. Peterson had asked about her support system. Julia had tried to answer normally, but the words had stuck in her throat. When she'd finally admitted that David was no longer in the picture, the doctor's expression had shifted to one of professional concern. "Have you considered speaking with someone?" Dr. Peterson had asked gently. Pregnancy can be challenging under the best circumstances, and going through it alone adds another layer of complexity. "I know an excellent therapist who specializes in these kinds of transitions." Julia had taken Dr. Smith's card with no intention of calling. She'd always been able to handle her problems alone. It was one of the things she'd been most proud. Oh, fuff. But as the days passed and the panic attacks began, as the sleepless nights stretched longer and her fears about motherhood grew sharper, Julia had finally admitted that she needed help she couldn't give herself. The irony wasn't lost on her that David's abandonment had forced her to confront the very vulnerabilities she'd spent her entire adult life trying to hide. In leaving her, he'd stripped away the illusion that she had everything under control, leaving her face to face with fears and inadequacies she'd never learned to address. Now, sitting in Dr. Smith's office with David's letter still folded in her purse, Julia was finally ready to admit that she had no idea how to do any of this alone. Dr. Kara Smith's office felt like a sanctuary from the chaos that had become Julia's life. The soft lighting, carefully chosen artwork, and the gentle sound of a water fountain in the corner created an atmosphere of calm that Julia desperately needed but couldn't quite trust. She sat in the comfortable leather chair across from Dr. Smith, a box of tissues within easy reach, and tried to find words for feelings she'd never allowed herself to examine. "You mentioned in our initial session that you're not sure you want this baby," Dr. Smith said gently, her voice carrying no judgment, only curiosity. "Can you tell me more about that?" Julia's hand moved instinctively to her belly, now rounded and unmistakable at 6 months. The baby kicked often these days, little flutters and bumps that should have filled her with maternal joy, but instead triggered waves of anxiety that left her breathless. "I keep thinking about my mother," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, about how cold she was, how nothing I ever did was good enough. The ultrasound photo tucked into Julia's purse seemed to burn with accusation. She'd looked at it dozens of times since her last appointment, studying the blurry outline of her daughter's face. Yes, a girl. Though she hadn't told anyone yet, and trying to imagine feeling the kind of love that was supposed to come naturally. Instead, all she could picture was disappointing this child the way Margaret had disappointed her. "Tell me about your relationship with your mother," Dr. Smith prompted, settling back in her chair with the patience of someone who understood that some stories took time to unfold. Julia closed her eyes, letting herself drift back to childhood. Memories she usually kept locked away. "She wasn't cruel," she began carefully. "Not in any way you could point to and say that was abuse. She fed me, clothed me, made sure I got to school on time. But she was so absent. Like I was just another task on her to-do list that she was handling efficiently, but without any real investment." The memories came in fragments. Margaret standing in the kitchen making dinner with mechanical precision, while Julia sat at the table doing homework, desperate for some acknowledgement beyond the occasional "finish your vegetables." Birthday parties, where Margaret provided the required cake and presents, but never seemed to actually see Julia's joy or disappointment. School events where her mother attended dutifully, but spent the entire time checking her watch, clearly eager to be anywhere else. "I remember one time when I was maybe 8 or 9, Julia continued, her voice growing stronger as the memory crystallized. "I'd made her a Mother's Day card at school, you know how kids do. Construction paper and glitter and poem about how much they love their mom. I was so excited to give it to her. I'd practiced reading the poem out loud because I wanted it to be perfect." Dr. Smith waited quietly, understanding that interruption would break the fragile thread of this recollection. When I gave it to her, she looked at it for maybe 10 seconds, said, "That's nice, honey," and set it on the counter. By evening, it was in the trash. Not even the recycling, the actual garbage, under coffee grounds and potato peels. Julia's laugh held no humor. I told myself she must have thrown it away by accident, but even then, I think I knew better. "That must have been incredibly painful for an 8-year-old, Dr. Smith observed. "The thing is, I became obsessed with figuring out what I'd done wrong. Like maybe if I made my next card better, or cleaner, or more grown-up, she'd keep it. I spent years trying to crack the code of what would make her love me the way other kids' mothers seem to love them." Julia's voice caught. "I never figured it out." Dr. Smith leaned forward slightly. "And now you're worried you'll repeat that pattern with your own child?" The question hit Julia like a physical blow. What if I don't know how to love her? The words tumbled out in a rush. What if whatever was broken in my mother is broken in me too? What if I look at my daughter and feel nothing but obligation and resentment? It was the fear she'd never spoken aloud, the terror that woke her up in cold sweats at 3 in the morning. Julia had built her adult life around being competent, reliable, successful, but motherhood seemed to require something deeper, something she wasn't sure she possessed. Love was supposed to be instinctual, wasn't it? Other women talked about falling in love with their babies the moment they saw them, about maternal instincts that kicked in automatically. What if Julia simply didn't have those instincts? "Your fear tells me something important," Dr. Smith said thoughtfully. It tells me you care deeply about being a good mother. Someone who was destined to repeat her mother's patterns wouldn't be sitting here examining these fears so honestly. But Julia wasn't comforted. Caring isn't enough, though, is it? My mother probably cared about doing right by me. She kept me safe, provided for me, made sure I had what I needed. But she never seemed to actually enjoy having a child. I was always more of a responsibility than a joy. The conversation was exhausting, dredging up feelings Julia had spent decades trying to bury. But there was also something liberating about finally saying these things out loud, about having someone listen without trying to reassure her that everything would be fine. Dr. Smith didn't offer empty platitudes or promise that maternal love would magically appear. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding the depth of Julia's fears. You mentioned that David left because he couldn't be the father this child deserves, Dr. Smith said, shifting the focus slightly. Do you think his departure was connected to your own fears about parenting? Julia had been asking herself the same question for weeks. Maybe. I mean, I never told him directly about any of this, but I wasn't exactly glowing with maternal excitement either. Maybe he could sense that I was terrified. Maybe he thought the baby deserved a mother who actually wanted her. The possibility that her own ambivalence had driven David away added another layer of guilt to Julia's already overwhelming emotional burden. Had her fears been so obvious that they'd convinced him she was unfit for motherhood? Had she inadvertently pushed away the one person who might have helped her through this transition? I keep thinking about how different things might have been if I'd been honest with him, Julia continued. If I'd told him I was scared instead of pretending everything was fine. But I've never been good at that kind of vulnerability. I learned early that keeping your feelings to yourself was safer than risking disappointment. Dr. Smith nodded knowingly. Children of emotionally unavailable parents often struggle with vulnerability as adults. When you're not sure how your emotions will be received, it feels safer to keep them hidden. The session was nearing its end, but Julia felt like they barely scratched the surface of everything she needed to understand. For the first time in weeks, though, she felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. Maybe she didn't have to figure this out alone. Maybe there were tools and insights that could help her become the kind of mother she'd always wished she'd had. The quarterly performance review envelope sat on Julia's desk like an accusation. She'd been dreading this moment for weeks, knowing that her recent struggles at work hadn't gone unnoticed. When she finally opened it, the words confirmed her. Worst fears, below expectations in client management, decreased attention to detail, recommendation for additional support and resources. The carefully diplomatic language couldn't hide the fact that Julia's professional facade was crumbling as spectacularly as everything else in her life. Tom knocked on her office door as she was staring at the review, his expression gentle but concerned. "Got a minute?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Tom had been her colleague for 5 years, and in many ways, he'd become the closest thing to a father figure Julia had ever known. His quiet wisdom and steady presence had always been a source of comfort, but today she felt too raw for even his kindness. "I saw the review," he said simply, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Want to talk about it?" Julia laughed bitterly, gesturing at the papers spread before her. "What's to talk about? I'm falling apart at work. David's gone, and I'm about to become a single mother to a child I'm not sure I want. Other than that, everything's fantastic." Tom was quiet for a moment, stunning her with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "Have you thought about taking some time off? You've got vacation days saved up, and maybe some space to figure things out would help." "I can't afford to take time off," Julia protested, even though the idea was tempting. "I need this job now, more than ever. How am I going to support a baby if I can't even handle my current responsibilities?" "You're 6 months pregnant and dealing with a major life crisis," Tom said gently. "Anyone would struggle under those circumstances. The question is whether you're getting the support you need to work through it." The support question had been weighing on Julia's mind since her last therapy session. Dr. Smith had mentioned group therapy again, suggesting that connecting with others who understood trauma and loss might help Julia feel less isolated. But the idea of sharing her private struggles with strangers felt terrifying, like voluntarily exposing every vulnerability she'd spent her life protecting. "My therapist thinks I should join a group," Julia admitted reluctantly. "Some kind of support circle for people dealing with major life transitions. But I can't imagine sitting in a room full of people talking about my mother and David and how scared I am of screwing up my kid." Tom considered this carefully. "What scares you most about it?" The question caught Julia off guard. She'd been so focused on her resistance to group therapy that she hadn't examined the root of her fear. "I guess judgment? Like, what if I tell them I'm not sure I want this baby and they think I'm a monster? What if they can see that I'm fundamentally broken in ways I don't even understand?" Or, Tom suggested quietly, what if they felt the same things you're feeling? What if sharing your fears actually helps you realize you're not as alone or as broken as you think? That evening, Julia sat in her apartment staring at Dr. Smith's business card, debating whether to call about the group sessions. The apartment felt enormous and empty without David's presence, every corner echoing with memories of the life they'd been building together. His absence was a constant ache, made worse by the complete silence that had followed his departure. No phone calls, no letters, no mutual friends reporting sightings. It was as if he'd simply evaporated. Lisa had been checking in daily, bringing groceries and offering to help with whatever Julia needed. But even Lisa's steadfast friendship couldn't fill the void that David's abandonment had created. Julia found herself lying awake at night, one hand on her growing belly, wondering what she'd done wrong and whether there were signs she should have recognized. "I keep replaying our last conversation," she'd told Lisa over dinner the night before. "We were talking about converting the spare room into a nursery, discussing paint colors and furniture." He seemed engaged, even excited. How was I supposed to know he was planning to leave? Lisa had listened with the patience of a true friend, but Julia could see the worry in her eyes. The panic attacks had started 2 weeks after David left Sutton. Overwhelming moments when Julia's chest would tighten and her breathing would become shallow and rapid. The first time it happened, she'd thought she was having some kind of pregnancy complication and had rushed to the emergency room. When the test came back normal and the doctor mentioned stress and anxiety, Julia had felt embarrassed and somehow fraudulent. The attacks were becoming more frequent, triggered by seemingly random things. The sight of David's favorite coffee shop, a commercial for baby products, even just waking up alone in their bed. Julia had started avoiding certain streets and stores, rearranging her life around the geography of her trauma in ways that felt both necessary and pathetic. At work, the strain was becoming impossible to hide. During a client presentation the previous week, Julia had lost her train of thought mid-sentence, staring blankly at the PowerPoint slide while her colleagues waited for her to continue. She'd recovered eventually, but the moment had been witnessed by 3 senior partners who were already questioning her recent performance. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine meeting with a long-standing client. Julia had been explaining a new marketing strategy when something in the client's tone, impatient, dismissive, had suddenly reminded her of her mother's voice. Without warning, Julia's chest had tightened, her vision had started to blur, and she'd found herself gasping for air in front of a conference room full of concerned faces. Tom had walked her to his car and driven her home, making calm excuses to the client while Julia sat in the passenger seat, trying to remember how to breathe normally. It was the most humiliating professional moment of her career, and it had finally forced her to acknowledge that she couldn't handle this crisis alone. "I think I need to call about that group," she told Tom as he walked her to her apartment door. "I can't keep falling apart at work. I can't afford to lose my job on top of everything else." Now, sitting with Dr. Smith's card in her hands, Julia finally dialed the number. When Dr. Smith answered, Julia's voice was steadier than she'd expected. "I'd like to know more about the group therapy option," she said. I think I need more help than I can handle on my own." Dr. Smith's voice was warm with approval. "I think that's a very wise decision. Julia, there's a group that meets Tuesday evenings that I think would be perfect for you. They're all dealing with major life transitions, and they're some of the most compassionate people I've ever worked with." As Julia wrote down the details, she felt a mixture of terror and relief. Maybe sharing her fears wouldn't make them worse. Maybe finding out she wasn't the only person who'd ever felt this lost would actually help her find her way forward. The circle of chairs in Dr. Smith's larger office felt both intimate and exposed. Julia arrived 10 minutes early for her first group session, her palms sweating despite the cool autumn evening. She'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a simple sweater that accommodated her growing belly without drawing too much attention to her pregnancy. The last thing she wanted was to be defined solely by her condition before these strangers even got to know her. 3 other people were already seated when she entered. Dr. Smith made gentle introductions, her voice carrying the same warmth Julia had come to rely on during their individual sessions. "Julia, I'd like you to meet Sarah, Michael, and Elena. Everyone, this is Julia, who I mentioned would be joining us." Sarah looked to be in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in the way that suggested both success and deep-seated insecurity. Her smile was genuine but tentative, as if she was still learning how to trust new people. Michael appeared to be around 50, with the comfortable manner of someone who'd spent years managing others, but now seemed uncertain about managing himself. Elena was younger, maybe early 30s, with an air of quiet sadness that spoke of recent and profound loss. "We were just talking about the concept of identity," Dr. Smith explained as Julia settled into the remaining chair. "How major life changes can make us question who we thought we were. Would you like to share what brought you here, or would you prefer to listen for a while?" Julia's instinct was to deflect, to claim she needed time to observe before participating. But something in the accepting expressions around the circle made her reconsider. "I'm 6 months pregnant," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "My boyfriend left 3 weeks ago with just a note. No explanation beyond saying he couldn't be the father our child deserves." The words hung in the air, and Julia braced herself for the awkward sympathy she'd grown tired of receiving from friends and coworkers. Instead, she found 3 pairs of eyes that held understanding rather than pity. "That must feel like such a betrayal," Sarah said quietly, "when someone you trust just disappears." Michael nodded. "The not knowing is almost worse than the loss itself, isn't it? At least when someone dies, you can grieve the relationship. When they choose to leave, you're left wondering what you did wrong." Julia felt tears threatening but didn't try to stop them. "Yes, exactly that. I keep replaying every conversation, every moment, trying to figure out what I missed. Like maybe if I'd been different somehow, if I'd said the right things or been the person he needed, he wouldn't have left." Elena leaned forward slightly. "I lost my mother 3 months ago. Cancer, and even though I knew it was coming, even though I had time to prepare, I still catch myself feeling angry at her for leaving me. It doesn't make sense, but grief doesn't seem to care about logic." The comparison surprised Julia. She hadn't thought of David's departure as something to grieve. But Elena was right. She was mourning not just the loss of him, but the loss of the future they'd planned together. The loss of the family she'd thought they were building. "I'm scared I'm going to mess up this baby," Julia admitted, the words coming out in a rush. My mother was so cold, so distant. What if I don't know how to love a child properly? What if David could see that in me and that's why he left? The group was quiet for a moment, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence Julia had feared. It felt thoughtful, as if they were all considering her words with the seriousness they deserved. "You know what strikes me about what you just said?" Sarah asked. "You're worried about loving your child properly. Someone who is truly incapable of love wouldn't have that concern. They just assumed they were fine." Dr. Smith nodded approvingly. "Sarah makes an excellent point. Julia, what do you think about that observation?" Julia considered this one, hand moving unconsciously to her belly where the baby was doing her evening gymnastics routine. "I never thought about it that way. I've been so focused on my fears that I forgot. People who don't care about being good parents don't usually worry about it, do they?" "My father never questioned his parenting," Michael said with a bitter laugh. "He was convinced he was doing everything right even when he was criticizing every choice I made. It took me 40 years to realize that his certainty was actually part of the problem." Michael's story unfolded gradually over the course of the session. He'd recently lost his job as a regional manager after 25 years with the same company, a victim of corporate restructuring that had nothing to do with his performance, but everything to do with his sense of identity. "I defined myself by my work for so long that when it was gone, I didn't know who I was anymore," he explained. "My wife keeps saying it's an opportunity for a fresh start, but at 52, a fresh start feels more terrifying than exciting." Sarah's story was different, but carried similar themes of identity crisis. Her divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, ending a marriage that had looked perfect from the outside, but had been slowly suffocating her for years. "I spent so much energy being the wife I thought I was supposed to be that I lost track of who I actually was," she said. "Now I'm free to be myself, but I have no idea what that means anymore." Elena's grief was the most raw. Her mother's death still fresh enough that she sometimes forgot and reached for her phone to call her. "She was my best friend," Elena said simply. "She was the person I talked to about everything. Now when something happens, good or bad, my first instinct is still to tell her about it. It's like losing a limb that you keep trying to use." As the group continued to share, Julia found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't expected. These weren't people who had their lives figured out offering advice from a position of superiority. These were people who understood what it felt like to have your entire sense of self upended by circumstances beyond your control. "I keep having dreams about my mother," Julia admitted during a lull in the conversation. "In the dreams, I'm holding my baby, but when I look down at her, she has my mother's disappointed face. Like even as an infant, she can see that I'm not good enough." "Dreams can be such powerful messengers," Dr. Smith observed. "What do you think that particular dream might be telling you?" "That I'm terrified of repeating my mother's mistakes. That maybe David saw something in me that reminded him of how cold and unavailable I can be." Julia's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "What if he was right to leave? What if I really can't be the mother this baby deserves?" Elena reached over and touched Julia's hand gently. "Can I tell you something my mother said to me right before she died? She said that the fact that I was worried about whether I was being a good enough daughter told her everything she needed to know about my character. She said people who truly don't care never question themselves." The parallel to Sarah's earlier comment wasn't lost on Julia, and she found herself smiling through her tears. "It seems like the theme tonight is that my anxiety might actually be a good sign." "Your anxiety tells us you care deeply," Dr. Smith confirmed. "The question is whether you can learn to trust yourself despite that anxiety. Whether you can begin to believe that caring is already a huge step toward being the mother you want to be." As the session wound down, the group made plans to meet again the following week. Julia exchanged phone numbers with Sarah and Elena. something she never would have imagined herself doing with virtual strangers just 2 hours earlier. But they didn't feel like strangers anymore. They felt like fellow travelers on a difficult journey, people who understood the terrain she was navigating. Walking to her car afterward, Julia realized that for the first time since David had left, she didn't feel completely alone. The circle of chairs that had seemed so intimidating when she'd first walked in now felt like a lifeline, a place where she could be honest about her fears without being judged for having them. The baby kicked as Julia started her car, a strong flutter that made her pause with her hand on her belly. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Maybe we're going to figure this out after all." For the first time in weeks, the possibility didn't feel completely impossible. Julia stood in the doorway of her childhood bedroom, breathing in the musty scent of old memories and accumulated regret. She'd driven to her mother's house in the suburbs to collect some baby items that Margaret had mentioned storing in the attic, a crib that had been Julia's, some blankets and clothes that might be salvageable. It was the first time she'd been back since telling her mother about the pregnancy, and the familiar weight of the house's silence pressed down on her like a physical thing. Margaret had greeted her with the same reserved politeness she'd shown Julia her entire life, offering coffee and asking perfunctory questions about her health without any real warmth behind the inquiries. They'd moved through the motions of normal mother-daughter interaction, both of them careful not to venture into territory that might require actual emotional engagement. "The baby things are in boxes in the guest room closet," Margaret had said, gesturing vaguely upstairs. "I wasn't sure what you'd want to keep and what you'd want to throw away, so I saved everything. Probably most of it's too old to be useful now." Julia had climbed the stairs alone, leaving Margaret in the kitchen with her crossword puzzle and lukewarm coffee. The guest room had once been Julia's bedroom, though any trace of her personality had been erased years ago in favor of neutral, beige walls and furniture that looked like it belonged in a hotel. Only the closet held any evidence of the child who'd once lived here, boxes labeled in Margaret's careful handwriting: Julia baby clothes, Julia toys, Julia school papers. It was the last box that caught Julia's attention. She'd never known her mother had kept any of her schoolwork, had assumed everything had been thrown away along with that long-ago Mother's Day card. With shaking hands, she lifted the lid and found herself looking at a carefully organized collection of report cards, art projects, and essays dating back to kindergarten. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was something that made Julia's breath catch in her throat: letters. A thick stack of letters in her mother's handwriting, some finished, some only half completed, all of them addressed to Robert, Julia's father, who had died when she was 3. Julia sank onto the guest room bed, her hands trembling as she unfolded the first letter, dated just 6 months after her father's death. "Robert," it began, "Julia asked about you again today. She wanted to know why you had to go away and when you're coming back. I didn't know what to tell her. How do you explain death to a 3-year-old? How do you explain that Daddy isn't coming back without terrifying her about everyone else she loves leaving too? I told her you had to go help other people, but she keeps asking when it will be your turn to come home. I'm failing her, Robert. I don't know how to be both parents. I don't know how to be enough." Julia's hand shook as she read letter after letter, each one revealing a side of her mother she'd never known existed. Margaret had written about her fears, her loneliness, her desperate attempts to do right by Julia while drowning in her own grief. She'd written about lying awake at night, wondering if she was loving Julia enough, if her emotional distance was protecting her daughter or damaging her. "I try to hug her more," one letter read, "but it feels so awkward now. Like I've forgotten how to show love without you here to remind me. Julia used to be so affectionate, always climbing into our bed for morning cuddles, always wanting to hold hands. But she's becoming more reserved, more careful around me. I think she can sense that I'm barely holding myself together. I think she's trying to protect me by needing less, and that breaks my heart more than I can express. Another letter, dated. When Julia was 7, she made me a card for Mother's Day. The poem was so sweet, all about how much she loves me. I wanted to tell her how proud I am, how much her love means to me, but the words just wouldn't come. Instead, I said, "That's nice," and put it on the counter. Later, when I found it in the trash can, Julia must have thrown it away when she cleaned up after dinner. I cried for an hour. Why can't I tell my own daughter that I love her? Why does every attempt at closeness feel like it might break me? Open completely? Julia was sobbing now, 28 years of hurt and confusion reshaping themselves as she read her mother's private pain. Margaret hadn't been cold because she didn't care. She'd been cold because she was drowning and afraid that her own brokenness would contaminate her daughter's childhood. She'd kept her distance not from lack of love, but from fear that her overwhelming grief would swallow them both. The final letter in the stack was different from the others. Dated just 5 years ago. Robert, Julia graduated college today. She looked so beautiful in her cap and gown, so accomplished and strong. I wanted to tell her how proud I am, how amazed I am by the woman she's become, despite all my failures as her mother. But I've been distant for so long that I don't know how to bridge that gap now. She's built a life where she doesn't need me, and maybe that's for the best. Maybe the greatest gift I could give her was learning to be independent, even if it meant she had to grow up without the kind of mother she deserved. I hope someday she understands that every choice I made was because I loved her, even when it didn't feel like love to either of us. Julia clutched the letters to her chest, finally understanding the source of her mother's emotional unavailability. Margaret had been a young widow trying to raise a child while managing her own devastating loss. Afraid that if she let herself feel everything, she wouldn't be able to function at all. She'd chosen distance as a survival strategy, never realizing that her daughter would interpret that distance as rejection. When Julia finally made her way back downstairs, she found Margaret exactly where she'd left her, still working on her crossword puzzle with mechanical precision. But now Julia could see the loneliness in her mother's careful posture, the weight of decades of unexpressed love and regret. "Mom," Julia said quietly, settling into the chair across from her, "I found some letters in the closet." "Letters you wrote to Dad?" Margaret's pen stopped moving, her entire body going very still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret looked up, and Julia saw fear in her mother's eyes, not anger or embarrassment, but genuine terror at having her deepest vulnerabilities exposed. "I never meant for you to see those," Margaret said finally, her voice barely audible. "I'm glad I did," Julia replied, and she meant it. "I wish I'd understood sooner. I wish I'd known you were grieving too." Margaret's composure cracked then, tears she'd held back for decades finally spilling over. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "Afraid that if I let myself fall apart, there would be no one left to take care of you. So I held everything in, and by the time I realized how much distance I'd created, I didn't know how to close it again." Julia reached across the table and took her mother's hand, the first time they'd touched with real tenderness in more years than either of them could count. "I'm scared too, Mom. I'm scared I'm going to make the same mistakes with my baby that I think you made with me. But reading those letters now, I understand that you were doing the best you could with what you had." They sat together in Margaret's kitchen, two women finally beginning to bridge a gap that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. Julia understood now that her fear of repeating her mother's patterns was actually a chance to break them, to choose connection over protection, vulnerability over distance. The letters had shown her that love sometimes looked like failure from the inside, but that didn't make it any less real or any less worth fighting for. Julia was standing in line at the coffee shop on 5th Street, one hand resting on her now prominent belly, when she heard a familiar laugh behind her. She turned around and found herself face to face with Mark Chun, David's closest friend and colleague from the high school where they both taught English. Her stomach dropped as she realized this was the first mutual acquaintance she'd encountered since David's departure, and she had no idea what he might know about their situation. Mark's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like guilt when he saw her. "Julia," he said, his voice careful and uncertain. "How are you doing? You look." He gestured vaguely at her pregnancy, clearly struggling with how to navigate this unexpected encounter. "I'm fine," Julia replied automatically, though they both knew it was a lie. She'd lost weight everywhere except her belly, stress having carved hollows under her eyes and around her cheekbones that made her look fragile despite her advancing pregnancy. "How are things at school?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the coffee shop as if looking for an escape route. "Listen, Julia, I wanted to reach out after what happened, but David asked us not to contact you, said you needed space to figure things out. I wasn't sure if I should respect that or—" "He asked you not to contact me?" Julia's voice was sharper than she'd intended. "What exactly did he tell you about what happened?" The question seemed to make Mark even more uncomfortable. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered David making when he was anxious. "Maybe we should sit down. This doesn't feel like a conversation for a coffee line." They found a corner table, and Julia waited while Mark struggled to find the right words. She could see him wrestling with something, some knowledge that he wasn't sure he should share. The medical records folder he'd been carrying caught her eye patient, information partially visible through the clear plastic cover. "David didn't tell me much," Mark began carefully. "Just that he had to leave because he couldn't be the father your baby deserved. He said it was better for everyone if he stayed away." Mark paused, studying Julia's face. "I always wondered if there was more to it. David's been struggling for a while now." "Struggling how?" Julia leaned forward, her heart beginning to race. Mark looked genuinely conflicted. "I probably shouldn't be the one telling you this. David was always private about personal stuff. But seeing you here, seeing how—" He stopped, seemed to make a decision. "Julia, David's been in therapy for severe depression and anxiety for almost 2 years. Since before you got pregnant. Maybe since before you two even moved in together." The words hit Julia like a physical blow. "That's impossible. I would have known. We lived together. I would have noticed if he was that depressed. He got very good at hiding it," Mark said gently. "The therapy appointments were during his lunch break. The medication he took at school so you wouldn't see it. He was terrified that if you knew how bad it was, you'd leave him." Julia's mind raced back through the last 2 years, re-examining moments she'd interpreted as David being tired or distracted, his increasing quietness in the evenings, his tendency to go for long walks when he seemed overwhelmed, the way he'd sometimes stare into space during dinner, lost in thoughts he never shared. "But why hide it from me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why wouldn't he trust me with something that important?" Mark's expression softened with something that looked like pity. "Because David grew up with a father who told him that depression was weakness, that real men didn't need therapy or medication to handle their problems. David was convinced that if you knew the truth about his mental health, you'd see him as broken, unfixable. When you got pregnant, it got so much worse." "Worse how?" "He was terrified he'd pass his depression onto the baby, either genetically or through his parenting. He kept talking about how his own father's untreated mental illness had damaged their family, how he couldn't risk doing that to his own child." Mark pulled the medical folder closer to himself, and Julia caught a glimpse of David's name on the papers inside. The pregnancy triggered some kind of crisis for him. He convinced himself that the baby would be better off without him in the picture. Julia felt like the world was tilting around her. Everything she'd believed about David's departure, everything she'd blamed herself for, was being rewritten in real time. So he didn't leave because he didn't want the baby? He didn't leave because I was a terrible partner? God, no, Mark said emphatically. Julia, David loved you so much it scared him. He talked about you constantly, how smart you were, how together you had your life, how lucky he felt that someone like you wanted to be with someone like him. That was part of the problem. He was convinced you deserved better than someone who could barely get out of bed some mornings. The revelation was almost too much to process. Julia had spent weeks analyzing every conversation, every interaction, trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. She'd assumed David's departure meant she was unlovable, that her fears about motherhood somehow driven him away. Now Mark was telling her that David had left, not because he didn't love her, but because he loved her too much to saddle her with what he saw as his own brokenness. "Where's he now?" Julia asked quietly. Mark hesitated again. "He's been staying at his brother's place across town. He's in intensive therapy twice a week plus a support group. He's trying to get better, Julia, but he's convinced that reaching out to you would be selfish. He thinks you and the baby are safer without him." Julia's anger flared suddenly, hot and bright. "That's not his decision to make. How dare he decide what's best for me and our child without even talking to me about it? How dare he leave me to think I did something wrong when he was the one keeping secrets?" "You're right to be angry," Mark said. "What he did wasn't fair to you. But Julia, you have to understand, David wasn't thinking clearly when he left. Depression doesn't just make you sad. It makes you genuinely believe that everyone you love would be better off without you. It's like having a voice in your head constantly telling you that you're poison, that your very presence damages everything you touch." Julia thought about her own struggles with depression since David's departure, the way her mind had twisted every interaction into evidence of her inadequacy. She could imagine how much worse that voice might be for someone already predisposed to those thoughts, especially when facing the enormous responsibility of becoming a father. "He's been asking about you," Mark continued quietly. "Asking if I've seen you around town, how you're doing with the pregnancy. He wants to know, but he's afraid that any contact from him would make things harder for you." "He's right about one thing," Julia said bitterly. "His leaving has made everything harder. I've been falling apart at work, having panic attacks, convinced that I'm going to be a terrible mother because I drove away the only man who ever claimed to love me." Mark's expression was pained. "Julia, David never stopped loving you. If anything, he left because he loves you too much to risk hurting you or the baby. It doesn't make what he did right, but it doesn't make it about you not being enough either." Julia sat in silence, trying to reconcile this new information with the narrative she'd constructed around David's departure. The relief of knowing she hadn't driven him away was mixed with fury at his presumption in making such a massive decision without her input. But underneath both emotions was something else, a desperate hope that maybe they could find a way forward. "From this, I need to see him," she said finally. "I need to hear this from him directly." Mark nodded slowly. "I think he needs to hear from you too." But Julia go into it knowing that he's not the same person he was when he left. The depression, the therapy, the guilt about leaving you, it's changed him. He might not be ready for the conversation you want to have. As Julia drove home, her mind churned with questions and possibilities. The man she'd thought she knew had been fighting a battle she never even realized was happening. The departure she'd interpreted as abandonment had been, in his mind, an act of love. Nothing about their relationship had been what she thought it was, and now she had to decide whether there was any way to build something real from the wreckage of all those misunderstandings. Julia sat in her car outside David's brother's apartment complex for 20 minutes before she finally turned off the engine. The journal in her lap was filled with pages of thoughts she'd been processing since her conversation with Mark III. Days ago, anger, hurt, confusion, and underneath it all, a desperate need to understand what had really happened between them. Dr. Smith had encouraged her to write down everything she wanted to say before confronting David, to process her emotions on paper before she tried to communicate them verbally. The apartment complex was unremarkable red brick, small balconies, the kind of place where someone might stay temporarily while figuring out their next move. Julia had driven by twice over the past few days, trying to work up the courage to actually get out of the car. Each time, she'd been overwhelmed by the magnitude of the conversation they needed to have and had driven home instead. Her therapy group had been invaluable in helping her prepare for this moment. Sarah had shared her own experience of confronting her ex-husband about the secrets that had destroyed their marriage, emphasizing the importance of going into such conversations with clear intentions rather than just emotional reactions. Michael had talked about the necessity of accepting that some relationships couldn't be salvaged, no matter how much you wanted them to be. Elena, ever wise in her grief, had reminded Julia that sometimes people leave because they're in too much pain. To stay, not because they don't love you. What's your goal in talking to him? Dr. Smith had asked during their individual session earlier that week. Are you hoping for reconciliation? Closure? Just understanding? Julia had struggled with that question. Part of her desperately wanted to repair their relationship, to find a way forward that included David as both partner and father. But a larger part of her needed something more fundamental. She needed to understand who they really were together when all the pretense was stripped away. She needed to know if there was any foundation of truth beneath all the careful performance they'd both been maintaining. I think I need to know if we ever really knew each other, Julia had finally answered. I need to understand whether what we had was real, or if we were both just playing roles we thought the other person wanted. The journal in her lap contained pages of questions she'd written over the past 3 days. Why hadn't he trusted her with his struggles? Did he really think so little of her that he assumed she'd abandon him at the first sign of difficulty? How long had he been planning to leave? Had anything about their relationship been genuine, or had she been in love with a performance? But the journal also contained something else, her own admissions of the ways she'd failed their relationship. She'd written about her tendency to present a perfect facade rather than sharing her real fears and insecurities. She'd acknowledged how her own emotional unavailability might have made it impossible for David to be vulnerable with her. She'd recognized that her need for control had probably created an environment where David felt he had to manage her feelings rather than deal with his own. The group therapy session the night before had been particularly intense. Julia had shared her plan to confront David, and the group had helped her think through various scenarios and responses. Elena had been especially insightful, pointing out that Julia's anger might be a way of protecting herself from the more vulnerable emotions underneath. When my mother was dying, Elena had said, I spent weeks being furious at her for getting sick, for leaving me, for all the conversations we'd never have. But underneath the anger was terror of being alone, of losing the person who knew me best, of having to figure out who I was without her. Sometimes anger feels safer than fear. Sarah had nodded knowingly. In my marriage, I stayed angry at my husband for years because it was easier than admitting how much is emotional. Distance was hurting me. Anger made me feel powerful. Hurt just made me feel pathetic. Dr. Smith had guided Julia to explore what emotions might be hiding beneath her fury at David's deception. Anger is often a secondary emotion, she'd explained. It usually protects us from feelings that seem too dangerous to experience directly. What do you think you might be protecting yourself from? Julia had known the answer immediately, though it had been difficult to say out loud. I'm protecting myself from hoping, she'd admitted. If I stay angry, I don't have to risk believing that we might be able to work through this. I don't have to risk being disappointed again. Now, sitting outside David's temporary home, Julia felt all of those emotions churning inside her: anger, hurt, hope, fear, love, resentment. The baby was unusually active today, as if she could sense her mother's emotional turmoil. Julia placed both hands on her belly, trying to draw strength from this little person who'd be affected by whatever happened in the next hour. "What do you think, baby girl?" she whispered. "Should we go find out if your daddy is as scared and confused as your mama is?" The decision to actually walk up to David's door came suddenly, without the careful planning Julia usually required for difficult conversations. She grabbed her journal, got out of the car, and walked toward the building before she could change. Her legs felt unsteady, partly from pregnancy and partly from nerves, but she forced herself to keep moving. The apartment building had an intercom system, and Julia stared at the directory for a long moment before finding Chun Robert, David's brother. She pressed the button and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hello?" The voice was David's unmistakably, though it sounded different, somehow flatter, more careful. "David, it's Julia. I need to talk to you." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Julia could hear her own breathing in the quiet hallway, could feel the baby's movements becoming more pronounced as her stress level increased. "Julia." David's voice was barely audible through the intercom. How did you find me here?" "I ran into Mark at the coffee shop. He told me about the depression, about the therapy. He told me why you really left." Julia's voice was steadier than she'd expected. "I need to hear it from you, David. I need to understand what really happened between us." Another long pause. Julia wondered if he was going to refuse to see her, if he'd ask her to leave and continue his strategy of protecting her by staying away. But finally, the door buzzed open. "Third floor, apartment 3B, David said quietly. The climb to the third floor felt endless. Julia's legs were shaky from nerves and the physical demands of pregnancy, and she had to stop twice to catch her breath. Each step brought her closer to a conversation that would either begin to heal the devastation of the past month or confirm that their relationship was truly beyond repair. When she reached the third floor, David was already standing in the hallway. Outside apartment 3B, the sight of him hit her like a physical blow. He looked terrible, thinner than she'd ever seen him, with dark circles under his eyes and a general air of exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights and internal struggle. But his eyes, when they met hers, were full of a pain that made her own anger seem suddenly less important. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, his gaze moving to her pregnant belly. "How are you feeling? Is everything okay?" The genuine concern in his voice almost undid her careful emotional preparation. This was the David she'd fallen in love with, the man who worried about her comfort, who noticed when she was tired, who had spent their entire relationship making sure she felt cared for. But now she also knew that this David had been carrying a burden she'd never even suspected, fighting battles she'd been completely unaware of. "Can we go inside?" Julia asked. "I think this conversation is going to take a while." David nodded and opened the apartment door, ushering her into a space that was clearly temporary borrowed furniture. Boxes still packed, the careful impersonality of someone who wasn't planning to stay long. Julia settled onto the couch, grateful to be off her feet, and watched as David chose a chair across from her, rather than sitting beside her. The distance felt deliberate, protective. "I'm sorry," David said before Julia could speak. "I'm sorry for leaving the way I did, for not talking to you first, for letting you think it was your fault. I know I handled everything wrong, but I didn't know how else to." He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture of anxiety. "I didn't know how to tell you that I was falling apart without dragging you down with me." Julia opened her journal, her hands steadier now that the conversation had finally begun. I need to understand some things, she said. And I need you to be completely honest with me, even if you think the truth will hurt me. We've had enough secrets. David nodded, his expression resigned but attentive. I'll tell you whatever you want to know. Julia looked down at her journal, at all the questions she'd carefully prepared, and realized that only one really mattered. Did you ever actually love me, David? Or were you just so good at pretending that even you believed it was real? David's face crumpled at Julia's question, and for a moment she thought he might start crying. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. Julia, I loved you so much it terrified me. I still love you. That's why I had to leave. Before Julia could respond, a sharp pain tore through her abdomen, so sudden and intense that she gasped and doubled over. At first, she thought it was just the baby reacting to her stress, but then another contraction hit, stronger than the first, and she realized with growing alarm that something was seriously wrong. Julia? David was on his feet immediately, his face pale with concern. What's happening? Are you okay? I think. Another contraction cut off her words, this one accompanied by a warm wetness that made Julia's heart race with panic. David, I think I'm going into labor. But it's too early. I'm only 34 weeks. David was already reaching for his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed 911. We need an ambulance, he said into the phone, his voice remarkably steady despite the terror in his eyes. My girlfriend is 34 weeks pregnant and she's having contractions. She might be going into premature labor. The next few minutes passed in a blur of pain and panic. David knelt beside Julia, holding her hand through each contraction, his face a mask of barely controlled fear. Just breathe, he kept saying, though his own breathing was rapid and shallow. The ambulance is coming. Everything's going to be okay. But Julia could see in his eyes that he was as terrified as she was. 34 weeks was too early. Babies born this premature could have serious complications, could need weeks in the ICU, could face long-term health problems. All of Julia's fears about motherhood suddenly seemed trivial compared to the possibility that her daughter might not be healthy, might not even survive. I'm scared, Julia whispered between contractions, gripping David's hand so tightly she knew she was hurting him. I know, David said, brushing her hair back from her sweating forehead. I'm scared too. But you're strong, Julia. You're the strongest person I know. And our baby, she's strong too. She's going to be okay. When the paramedics arrived, they quickly assessed Julia's condition and confirmed what she already knew. She was in active labor, and there was no stopping it. They loaded her onto a stretcher, and David climbed into the ambulance beside her, his hand never leaving hers during the frantic ride to the hospital. Sir, are you the father? One of the paramedics asked as they worked to monitor Julia's contractions and the baby's heart rate. David looked at Julia, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. They hadn't resolved anything between them, hadn't figured out whether their relationship could survive the secrets and misunderstandings that had torn them apart. But Julia squeezed his hand and nodded, and David's voice was firm when he answered, Yes, I'm the father. At the hospital, everything moved with frightening efficiency. Julia was rushed into a delivery room while nurses asked rapid-fire questions about her medical history and pregnancy complications. David stood beside her bed, still holding her hand, looking lost and terrified in his rumpled clothes and day-old stubble. Dr. Martinez will be here in just a few minutes, one of the nurses assured them. She's one of our best specialists in premature births. Your baby is in excellent hands. As they waited for the doctor, David sat beside Julia's hospital bed, his face etched with worry and guilt. This is my fault, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the beeping monitors. The stress I put you through, leaving you alone. Don't, Julia interrupted. her voice fierce despite her exhaustion. Don't you dare blame yourself for this. Sometimes babies come early. Sometimes things happen that aren't anyone's fault. But even as she said the words, Julia couldn't help wondering if the emotional turmoil of the past month had contributed to the premature labor. The panic attacks, the sleepless nights, the constant stress of trying to figure out how to be. Single mother, had all of that taken a toll on her baby? Dr. Martinez arrived just as another strong contraction gripped Julia, and she quickly examined both mother and baby. The good news is that your baby's heart rate is strong and steady, she told them, her calm confidence immediately reassuring. At 34 weeks, we're looking at some challenges, but nothing we can't handle. The NICU team is standing by, and we have everything we need to give your daughter the best possible care. Daughter? David's voice cracked slightly. We're having a daughter? Julia had known for weeks, but hadn't told anyone, really. In the chaos of his departure and her emotional crisis, she'd kept that piece of information to herself, unsure who she wanted to share it with. Now, seeing the wonder and terror mix in David's expression, she felt a stab of regret for all the moments they'd missed together. Yes, she whispered. A daughter. David's eyes filled with tears, and he leaned down to press his forehead against Julia's. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry for missing this, for not being here, for letting my own fears keep me away. From you and her. Another contraction cut through their conversation, stronger than any before it, and Dr. Martinez's expression became more focused. All right, Julia. It looks like your daughter has decided she's ready to meet you. Let's have this baby. The birth itself was faster than anyone expected. One moment, Julia was gripping David's hand through another contraction, and the next she was pushing with every ounce of strength she had left. David stayed by her side throughout, his face a mixture of awe and terror as he witnessed their daughter's entrance into the world. When the baby finally emerged, the room fell silent for a heartbeat, no immediate cry, no sound except the rapid activity of the medical team. Julia's heart stopped as she watched the NICU specialists work over her daughter's tiny form, checking airways, monitoring vital signs, doing things that looked both routine and terrifying. Then, finally, a small but strong cry filled the room, and Julia burst into tears of relief. She's breathing on her own, Dr. Martinez announced with a smile. Good lung development for 34 weeks. That's exactly what we wanted to hear. Julia caught only a glimpse of her daughter before the NICU team whisked her away for more comprehensive evaluation. A tiny, perfect human being with dark hair, and David's nose, so small she could have fit in Julia's hands, but unmistakably alive and fighting. The photograph one of the nurses quickly snapped and handed to Julia showed a baby who looked determined rather than fragile. Her little fists clenched as if she was ready to take on whatever challenges awaited her. Can I see her again? Julia asked, her voice weak from exhaustion and overwhelming emotion. Once we get her stabilized in the NICU, absolutely, Dr. Martinez assured her. She's going to need to stay here for a few weeks while her lungs finish developing, but her prognosis is very good. You should be proud. You've got a fighter on your hands. As the medical team finished their work and the room gradually quieted, Julia found herself alone with David for the first time since the crisis had begun. He was still holding her hand, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the photograph of their daughter. She's perfect, he whispered. Julia, she's absolutely perfect. Julia studied his face, seeing not the man who had abandoned her with a note, but the father who had just witnessed his daughter's birth with wonder and terror and overwhelming love. David, she said quietly, we need to talk. Really talk this time. David nodded, wiping his eyes with his free hand. I know. I owe you so many explanations, so many apologies. I don't even know where to start. Start with the depression, Julia said. How long have you been struggling? David was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. Since I was a teenager, really. But it got much worse about 2 years ago, right around the time we started getting serious. The closer we got, the more terrified I became that you'd see who I really was underneath all the pretending. What did you think I'd see? Someone broken. Someone who had days where getting out of bed felt impossible, who took medication just to feel normal, who had a family history of mental illness that I was terrified of passing on to our children. David's voice was barely audible. My father suffered from untreated depression my entire childhood. He was angry, distant, critical, everything I swore I'd never become. When he got pregnant, all I could think about was how I might damage our child the way he damaged me. Julia felt a mixture of sadness and frustration. But that wasn't your decision to make alone, David. Don't you think I deserved to know what you were going through? Don't you think I deserved the chance to decide for myself whether I could handle loving someone with depression? I was so afraid. You'd leave, David admitted. You had your life so together, so perfectly organized and controlled. I couldn't imagine someone like you wanting to deal with someone like me long term. The irony wasn't lost on Julia. David, I've been falling apart for months. I've been terrified that I'll be a terrible mother, convinced that I'm too damaged by my own childhood to raise a healthy child. We were both hiding from each other, both pretending to be people we weren't. David looked at her with something that might have been relief. You've been struggling too. I've been in therapy since you left, working through my own fears about repeating my mother's mistakes. I joined a support group because I couldn't handle the crisis alone. I'm not the perfectly together person you thought I was, David. I'm just someone who got very good at hiding her problems. They looked at each other across the hospital bed, two people finally seeing each other clearly for perhaps the first time in their relationship. Julia felt a shift happening, a possibility opening up that hadn't existed when they were both performing their idealized versions of themselves. Our daughter is going to need both of us, Julia said finally. She's going to need parents who are honest about their struggles, who get help when they need it, who don't try to pretend they're perfect. Do you think we can learn to be those parents? David squeezed her hand, hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. I want to try. I want to be the father she deserves, even if that means continuing therapy, taking medication, working every day to be better than I was yesterday. Then let's try, Julia said. Not to fix each other, not to be perfect, but to be real. To be honest. To build something genuine instead of something that looks good from the outside. Through the window of Julia's room, they could see into the NICU, where their daughter lay in an incubator, tiny but determined, surrounded by machines, but fighting to grow stronger every moment. She was their future, fragile but resilient, requiring careful attention but full of potential. 3 months later, Julia sat in the rocking chair in their daughter's nursery, watching David hang the mobile he'd made during one of his woodworking therapy sessions. The mobile was simple, but beautiful small wooden birds painted in soft pastels, suspended from a carefully balanced frame that turned slowly in the gentle breeze from the open window. Each bird was slightly different, imperfect in ways that made them more beautiful rather than less. Elena Rose, named for Julia's group therapy friend who had become like a sister to her, slept peacefully in Julia's arms. Finally home after 6 weeks in the NICU. She was still small for her age, but her lungs had developed beautifully, and her pediatrician was optimistic about her continued growth. More importantly, she was alert and responsive, seeming to study her parents' faces with the serious concentration of someone trying to figure out this strange new world she'd entered. I think she likes it, David said, stepping back to admire his handwork. The mobile cast gentle shadows on the wall as it turned, creating a peaceful movement that Elena seemed to find soothing. Dr. Harrison said that visual stimulation would be good for her development. David had been attending therapy twice a week since Elena's birth, working not just on his depression, but on his communication skills and his tendency to make major decisions without consulting the people they affected. He was still taking medication, still had difficult days, but he was learning to share those struggles instead of hiding them. Julia had been amazed to discover that knowing about David's depression actually made her feel closer to him, not more distant. His vulnerability had created space for her own. Julia's relationship with her mother had also undergone a transformation that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Margaret had spent every day at the hospital during Elena's NICU stay, and in those quiet hours, sitting together watching their tiny granddaughter fight to grow stronger, she and Julia had finally begun to bridge the emotional distance that had defined their relationship for decades. "She has your father's hands," Margaret had observed one afternoon, studying Elena's tiny fingers through the incubator's walls. Long and elegant. He would have loved her so much. It was the first time Margaret had spoken about Julia's father, with warmth rather than the careful neutrality she'd maintained for 35 years. Gradually, other memories had emerged, stories about the young man who had died too soon, leaving behind a wife who had been too devastated to grieve properly, and a daughter who had never known how much she was loved. "I'm sorry I couldn't be the mother you needed," Margaret had said during one of their hospital vigils. "I was so afraid of falling apart that I forgot you needed me to be present, not just functional." Julia had reached over and taken her mother's hand, still carefully manicured, still cold from years of habit, but warmer somehow than Julia remembered. "We're both learning how to do this better," she'd replied. "Maybe Elena will teach us." The group therapy sessions had continued throughout Elena's NICU stay, providing Julia with a support system she'd never imagined possible. Sarah had become a close friend, someone Julia could call when the fears about motherhood threatened to overwhelm her. Michael had offered practical advice about career transitions, helping Julia navigate the process of reducing her work hours so she could spend more time with Elena. Elena, the friend, not the baby, had shared her hard-won wisdom about grief and healing, reminding Julia that recovery was a process, not a destination. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Julia said to David as he made final adjustments to the mobile. "I think about how different things might have been if we'd been honest with each other from the beginning. If you told me about the depression, if I'd shared my fears about motherhood." David settled into the chair beside the rocking chair, his expression thoughtful. "I used to torture myself with those same thoughts. But Dr. Patterson helped me realize that maybe we both needed to go through our individual crises before we could build something real together. Maybe we had to fall apart separately before we could figure out how to be honest with each other." Julia looked down at Elena, who had awakened and was studying her parents with those serious dark eyes. "What do you think, little bird?" she asked softly. "Did you come early because you knew we needed help figuring things out?" Elena made a soft sound that might have been agreement, and David laughed, the first completely carefree laugh Julia had heard from him since before Elena's birth. "I think she's smarter than both of us put together." The apartment around them bore little resemblance to the sterile perfection Julia had once maintained. There were baby supplies scattered on surfaces, books about child development stacked on coffee tables, photos from Elena's NICU graduation ceremony arranged on the mantel alongside the ultrasound pictures Julia had finally felt brave enough to display. It was messier, more lived in, but it felt like home in ways their previous space never had. "I love you," David said suddenly, looking directly at Julia with an openness that still sometimes caught her off guard. "I love you for fighting for us when I was too scared to fight for myself. I love you for seeing Elena as perfect, even when she was tiny and fragile. I love you for teaching me that being broken doesn't mean being unlovable." Julia felt tears threaten, but they were good. Tears of gratitude and hope, rather than fear and despair. "I love you too," she replied. "I love you for coming back, for doing the work, for being brave enough to be real with me. Elena stirred in Julia's arms, making the soft sounds that meant she was getting hungry. As Julia prepared to feed her daughter, she marveled at how natural motherhood had begun to feel. Not easy, Elena was still recovering from her premature birth, still required extra care and attention, but natural in a way Julia had never expected. Outside the nursery window, the city hummed with its usual energy, but inside this small room, three people who had almost lost each other were building something new, something honest, something that could weather whatever storms lay ahead because it was built on truth rather than performance, on love rather than fear. The mobile turned slowly above Elena's crib, casting gentle shadows that danced across the walls like promises of all the good days to come.